Hi, it's Albie on tour again, and this rather idyllic looking country scene is one of the biggest slaughtering grounds in the world, certainly in Europe. And what you're seeing here is the battlefield of Passchendaele. First World War, fought July 1917, ended November 1917, so nearly 5 months worth of battle. And over there were the British, Canadian, Australian and New Zealand lines, and where I'm actually stood is our largest cemetery, Commonwealth cemetery. Again, countries of the Commonwealth: Britain, Canada, Australia, New Zealand. And where I'm actually stood when the battle first started, this was the German front line. And you'll see that cross there in the middle. That was actually a German pillbox. There are several others on the site, and the place is lovingly cared for by the Commonwealth War Graves Commission. And here there are 11,957 Commonwealth soldiers buried, many of them not known who they are, what their names are, and I believe there are 11 or so Germans buried in the cemetery. And on the walls at the back are the names of those who haven't got a grave from, I think it was the 15th of August 1917 till the end of the war. So those who went missing in action, their names are engraved on the panels on the wall at the back of the cemetery itself. Quite a few visitors today. It's end of September, quite bright. So as far as the eye can see, nearly grave after grave after grave. I'm at the back of the Tyncott Cemetery now. It's not my first visit here. My first one was 2 years ago for this. And this is the memorial to the soldiers of the Sherwood Forest Regiment, Derbyshire and Nottinghamshire. And believe it or not, these were the very last regiment to ever get some sort of a memorial to who fell in the First World War. And as chairman of a local council back in England, we donated money to help get the stone carved, and me and the wife came over one very, very wet, damp, cold October morning 2 years ago in 2009. And that's it. So for those of you who watch this who live in Derbyshire or Nottinghamshire, that's the memorial to the soldiers that fell. Around about 11,400 in total in the First World War, and a few are buried here at Tyncott. Just over there, that church spire houses, that is Passchendaele village itself. And this is the back end of the cemetery. I'm just outside the back wall and the Sherwood Forest monument just down there. And back in 1917 this was a quagmire. Rain just turned into just sludge and mud. And quite a few of the soldiers, a good proportion, actually died by drowning in the shell holes full of water. And in the total time of the battle, from July to November, when the Canadians finally got over there to Passchendaele, the casualties, that's killed, wounded and missing, for the British and Commonwealth was 245,000, and for the Germans 215,000, so nearly 500,000. I'm stood in the middle of Ypres town centre now, right in the central parking spot. That down there is the Menin Gate, and these are the cafes and restaurants. But if I just swing round, and here is what they call the Cloth Hall. This is the centre, and the far end is now the museum. And all of this in the First World War was completely and utterly flattened, everything. So as reparation for the war, the Germans had to pay for all of this to be completely rebuilt, and the cathedral that's behind there. And this is the main cathedral in Ypres, and just across there is the Cloth Hall. And again, this was very badly damaged in the Great War. It was on fire at one point after being shelled by the Germans. And everything else around here again was largely flattened. And the reason why is that this route through here, Ypres, was the Germans' main route to get to the North Sea and to the North Sea ports. So that's why there was 3 years of fighting here. Okay, this is the top of the Menin Gate, so I'm effectively stood on the old town wall ramparts. That's looking out of the town that way. It's not a very good day for filming, I'm afraid, and just down there, 150, 200 yards, is the centre of the town. And the gate itself replaced an earlier town gate, and the main reason for this being here is to commemorate those who fell, the Commonwealth soldiers that fell between the start of the war and the 15th of August 1917, who don't have a known grave. and there's 54,000 names on these walls. So I'm on the top side here, really on the eastern side of the monument, and literally the whole of the arch, the walls, just covered with names. 54,000 of them here, and when they do find a body and can identify a body, then they find that person's name on here and remove it from the wall. Just outside the town walls now, just looking at the Menin Gate, and that side of it up there, which is being renovated, can't get up to it, is where most of the names from the soldiers from the Sherwood Foresters, the Nottinghamshire, Derbyshire and Lincolnshire regiments are on that wall up there. And through there on that side of the archway is Canadian, and up the steps to the other side where I filmed a few minutes ago, Canadian, Yorkshire, Lancashire regiments. And the 54,000 names there, they're only the ones that are lost in this area, not the whole war. So I know that we lost 889,000 soldiers in the First World War, all across the battlefront. And it's quite picturesque here. The old town walls, and I suppose you call it a moat that runs around. And through what was the original Menin Gate would have been where a lot of the soldiers marched out from Ypres and along these roads here out to the battlefields, just in some cases less than a mile away. This is Essex Farm, which was a field dressing hospital in the Great War, and the cemetery that's here at the side of it, I think, speaks for itself. So the battlefront, I would presume, would be over in that direction somewhere. Doesn't seem to be a lot here anymore, apart from the monument and this rather large embankment and the canal. And these look like some of the old trenches and bunkers of the field hospital. I presume that I won't see anything in here. These were the operating theatres, maybe. Normally the troops would just come here to be patched up and sent back on the way again. So this Essex Farm Field Hospital is where John McCrae, Canadian surgeon and doctor, he worked here, and he's the man that wrote the famous poem In Flanders Fields in 1915, and he's believed to have written it here while working. He also died in the war, and I'm not sure whether he's buried here in the cemetery or elsewhere, but the cemetery is mainly British and Canadian here, and there are a few Germans and a few soldiers unknown to anybody but God. Okay, now somewhere a little bit different from the Ypres area in Belgium. We're in France now, and that view over there, another idyllic farming vista. I'm literally on the front line of the Battle of the Somme. So where I'm stood, as I'll turn around in a minute, is on a crater of a mine that was exploded at the start. In fact, 2 minutes before the push over the top started on the 1st of July 1916, Commonwealth mining engineers mined under this front line area where the Germans were, and blew it up basically. So as I pan round, hopefully you will see there is one very deep crater. It's known as the crater of Lognagar, and over there in the distance is the town of Albert, which was held by the Allies, and this area, the commemorative cross, was where the Germans roughly were at the start of the battle, and over a period of some 4 or 5 months that eventually the Germans were pushed back several kilometres that way to a new front line, and at the loss on both sides of 1.2 million casualties. That's dead, missing, wounded. And in this crater there was roughly 60,000 pounds of high explosive that was detonated. The land is actually owned by an Englishman who bought it to preserve the crater and obviously act as a memorial. As I look over to the village over there, which was completely blown apart during the offensive, and in that general direction is Sept, which is where the main cemetery for the Allied fallen is. I certainly wouldn't have wanted to have been anywhere near this when it went bang. And it was detonated 2 minutes before the Allied troops pushed over the top, which would be 100 yards or so behind me, 100 metres behind me. And this would have been roughly the German front line. Unfortunately, this wasn't a success, as the push effectively stalled, and I was assuming the fields over there was where some of the 19,000 troops, Allied troops, fell in the first day. Now move to Sept. That's the village of Sept over there, and we're actually at the site of the British War Memorial Monument and the mass graves here. One of the largest monuments, I think, actually in the France-Belgium region for fallen soldiers. And over there, the Germans would have been over there, and the Allies, mainly British Allies, here the French would have been further, much further down that way. But for me, I suppose quite poignant, because my grandfather was here. He was on the Somme. I know very little about him. He would have been 24 years old when the Battle of the Somme started, but I know, as far as I know, he went over the top and was injured, walking wounded. He walked back to a field hospital, was patched up, sent back to the front, and by the time he got back to the front, half the battalion were dead, had been cut down. So a battalion was 800 men, so around about 400 died going over the top, and luckily my grandfather survived it. Although I never met him. He died in 1956, about 9 years before I was born, so I never met him, unfortunately. And another relative of mine, my great uncle Arthur, who I did meet, he, I think, was on the Somme, but I'm not totally sure about that. But I do know he was gassed. He was caught in a gas attack, and it virtually made him an invalid later in life. When I knew him as a young kid, he never used to move far from a chaise lounge, a kind of a sofa, and my Aunt Maud's. But certainly the Great War had a big effect on his physical health. Okay, I'm now at the memorial for the British and Allied troops here at Sept. This would have been part of the front line of the battlefield back then, and there's the memorial, seen on many pictures. And it's quite remarkable to think that all the trees and everything around here are new. Virtually none of the trees in the whole of the battlefield area are ancient. They were all blown apart, burnt, and I think there is one wood near here where there is one surviving tree from the wood, an ancient tree, but all the rest are less than 100 years old. And this is the cemetery here at Sept. I'm actually in the monument, or underneath the monument, to the fallen of the Somme. And quite amazingly, the amount of artillery, shells and everything else that was used. In the first day, 1st of July 1916, the Allied forces let go 1.6 million artillery shells in one day, which is quite amazing. And hard to think this peaceful place was once the centre of the battle, even though the battle did last for 4 months and stretched getting on for 8 to 10 miles from start to finish. Another day, and on our little tour, another war. And you can probably see that I'm on a beach. I'm in Normandy, and this is actually Omaha Beach. This is where the Americans landed on the 6th of June 1944. We just come here to have a look and have a look at the museum. So most of the other beaches were down in that direction. So the Americans here, Utah, this is Utah Beach, as I said. The other ones are in that direction, and just over the back there is the museum. I'm not sure if I had any family that landed on D-Day. I certainly had some relatives that were fighting in this part of the Second World War, but I'm not too sure about on my side of the family. But you can imagine the Germans on behind me just firing at everything that was coming on shore. I don't think this would have been a particularly pleasant place to be back then. This is the Point de Hoc, a peninsula that juts out between the Omaha beaches just down there in the east, and to the west on the horizon that's the Utah beaches. And this is where the German gun emplacements were, and the Germans thought this was virtually impregnable. So you can see lots of craters and pits and hollows. It was bombed by the Allies prior to the invasion to try and knock out these heavy artillery guns that were designed and placed here so the guns could fire either east or west onto any attacking force coming onto the beaches. So it's on a cliff, it's on a promontory, and a force of Americans, 225, actually came up the cliffs and attacked the emplacements and neutralised them. Can't get too close to the cliffs obviously. There's one of the gun emplacements there, and as I say, you can see plenty of craters. Now on the last part of our short trip through the battlefields, and we're now at a place called Remembrance. And those objects you can see out there in the sea are the remains of the Mulberry harbours, which were floating harbours that were brought in to allow goods, equipment, troops to be disembarked from larger ships well away from the shoreline. Behind me is the museum, which we're going to pop into shortly. Don't know a vast amount of the Mulberry Harbours, but those are the remains of the floating stages there. I do believe that during the war, initially, some old ships that they had, they sunk them at the side of these piers that float out to protect them from enemy boats coming in loaded with explosives trying to blow them apart. And now at the end of the battlefield tour that we've been doing over the last 3-4 days, and quite a fitting end really, I suppose. We're in the Chateau de Caen, and this, well, the remains and ruins here were the remains of William the Conqueror's palace. The hall slightly dated there at the side of it, which is still intact, but his palace here, they're the ruins. And a later building, I believe, was built by Henry II in about 1120 here. But the home of the ancestral home of the Normans. And a fine and fitting place, I think, to end. A later chateau here. It was occupied by the Germans in the Second World War, and a lot of damage was done when the Allied armies came here to take it back. But nice place to end what's been quite a good tour of northern France and Belgium. And now at the end of the battlefield tour that we've been doing over the last 3-4 days, and quite a fitting end really, I suppose. We're in the Chateau de Caen, and this, well, the remains and ruins here were the remains of William the Conqueror's palace. The hall slightly dated there at the side of it, which is still intact, but his palace here, they're the ruins. And a later building, I believe, was built by Henry II in about 1120 here. But the home of the ancestral home of the Normans. And a fine and fitting place, I think, to end. A later chateau here. It was occupied by the Germans in the Second World War, and a lot of damage was done when the Allied armies came here to take it back. But nice place to end what's been quite a good tour of northern France and Belgium.